Okay, look around your own town, your city. Chances are you see it too, right?
Yeah.
Neighborhoods that are still, well, pretty segregated by race, even now.
Right. And we hear all sorts of reasons why.
Yeah, like it's just about money, or maybe, people want to live near people like them,
Hmm.
or it's just leftover prejudice from individuals.
It kind of feels like it just happened naturally, like the result of a million private
But
decisions.
what if that whole story, the one we usually accept, is just wrong?
That's exactly the bombshell Richard Rothstein drops in his book, The Color of Law, a forgotten history of how our government segregated America.
Okay.
His core argument is that the segregation we see everywhere, in basically every city, isn't an accident. It's not mainly about those private choices, that de facto stuff.
So if it's not de facto, what is it?
Rothstein lays out this incredibly detailed case showing it was de jure. It was created on purpose and kept in place by specific government policies.
Government policies,
Yeah.
like local, state.
All of them. Local, state, and federal. Explicit actions, deliberate decisions. That's what this deep dive is about, digging into that history Rothstein uncovered. Because, wow, it really changes how you see things today.
All right, let's start right there. Let's really push back on that comfortable idea, that myth of de facto segregation.
Yeah, the story that goes, well, it's too bad, but it's mostly just people's preferences or income differences or, maybe some biased landlords or banks acting on their own.
Mm-hmm.
And Rothstein says, nope, that's not just wrong. It's a narrative that's been pushed, especially since the 70s. He even points to the Supreme Court helping to solidify that idea.
Ah, okay, so this is where the legal distinction really matters.
Yeah.
He talks about that 1974 Supreme Court case, Milliken v. Bradley,
Right.
about Detroit schools.
Exactly. The court basically said, look, the segregation in Detroit schools, well, that's de facto. It happened because of, who knows? Unknown and perhaps unknowable factors, they said. Maybe migration patterns, maybe private fears.
Right. And they said the Constitution only demands a fix if the segregation was de jure caused by government action.
And Rothstein's entire book is essentially a giant rebuttal to that specific point in Milliken. He's saying, are you kidding? The government wasn't passive at all. It was the driver.
From way back.
Oh, yeah, early 20th century. You had cities like Baltimore, Atlanta, Louisville passing actual laws, ordinances, saying black families couldn't live on blocks where most residents were white and vice versa. Explicit racial zoning.
Well, didn't the Supreme Court knock that down pretty early on, like 1917?
They did in Buchanan v. Worley. They struck down that kind of explicit racial zoning.
Yeah.
But cities got creative. They found workarounds.
Like what?
Things like zoning land near black neighborhoods for polluting industries only, making it undesirable, or using building codes selectively. The idea that government should enforce separation didn't just disappear after that ruling. White leaders kept pushing for it.
And it wasn't just cities acting alone.
No way. The federal government got deeply involved. Think about public housing, built during the New Deal, during World War II. A lot of that was explicitly segregated by federal rules. Rothstein uses the example of Richmond, California. During the war, they needed housing for defense workers, right? So federally funded housing for black workers. It was built kind of flimsy, meant to be temporary, stuck out near the railroad tracks.
And for white workers.
Sturdier homes, permanent, built further inland, in nicer spots. The government itself deliberately created segregated patterns that are still there.
And wasn't there that whole fight over the Sojourner Truth Homes project in Detroit?
Oh, absolutely. A classic example. Federal officials planned housing for black defense workers, but fierce opposition erupted from white neighbors, politicians worried about property values. It got ugly.
Riots, even.
Yes. And initially, officials kind of buckled, suggesting sites in industrial areas instead. When black families finally did move into the original planned location, there were riots, and the police protection was, let's say, inadequate. It shows government wasn't just passively watching. Its decisions or inaction directly enabled segregation.
So these weren't just isolated incidents.
Not at all. They were pieces of this machinery of segregation that government built all across the country. That's really what the next part of Rothstein's work details.
Maybe the biggest gear in that machine was housing finance. Federal housing finance.
Oh, unquestionably. The FHA, the Federal Housing Administration, started in the 1930s. It basically revolutionized home buying, made mortgages affordable for millions.
Yeah.
But
There's always a but.
a huge one. The FHA made its loan guarantees the backing that banks and developers absolutely needed conditional. The condition was that the properties could not be sold or rented to African Americans.
Wow. So they weren't just okay with private bias, they were requiring racial exclusion to get federal support.
Exactly. It's right there in black and white in their official manuals. The 1936 underwriting manual told appraisers, point blank, to give higher ratings to neighborhoods protected by restrictive covenants.
Those clauses on deeds saying no sales to black people.
Those exact ones. The manual warned against the infiltration of inharmonious racial or nationality groups. If a neighborhood was racially mixed, or even near one, lower rating, less likely to get FHA backing.
That's redlining. That's literally where it came from.
That's textbook redlining baked into federal policy. It wasn't just assessing risk, it was government actively promoting racial segregation.
And then you have the big post-war developers like Levittown.
William Levitt, yeah. He openly admitted he was 100% dependent on government financing FHA, and later the VA, the Veterans Administration, which adopted similar policies.
So that whole explosion of suburban homeownership after World War II,
Yeah.
the main way the white middle class built wealth,
Was a government-subsidized system that explicitly shut out black families. It wasn't just about income. It was about the government actively channeling wealth-building opportunities to white people and away from black people for generations.
that really puts the current wealth gap in a different light, doesn't it?
A completely different light. It's not just happenstance. It's a direct legacy of these discriminatory government policies.
Okay, so beyond financing, what about public housing itself? You mentioned it was segregated early on.
Yes, and how it was managed reinforced segregation, too. Often, sites for black housing projects were deliberately chosen in industrial areas or isolated spots. And then, around 1950, there was a big policy shift. Public housing became restricted only to the very poorest families. This pushed out working-class and middle-class residents, both black and white.
So it concentrated poverty.
Exactly. Which contributed to the decline and negative image of many projects and made any kind of stable, integrated public housing almost impossible. You even had President Nixon saying, point blank, we're not going to force integration by putting public housing in white suburbs.
Which brings us to the courts and police. We know about the Shelley v. Kramer case. In 1948, the Supreme Court said courts couldn't enforce those racial covenants anymore.
Right. A major victory on paper. But Rothstein highlights that even after Shelley, courts allowed those covenants to just stay on the deeds for years. They weren't enforceable by the court, but their presence still sent a signal, gave them a kind of official shadow.
And what about law enforcement on the ground?
That's another crucial piece. Rothstein provides chilling examples. When black families did manage to buy or rent in previously all-white areas.
Like the Myers family in Levittown, Pennsylvania, or Trumbull Park in Chicago.
Exactly those cases, among others. Local police often just stood by while white mobs attacked them, or they responded slowly. Or sometimes they were actively complicit with the mob.
So the message was clear.
Yeah.
The state wouldn't protect your right to live there.
Precisely. It effectively enforced segregation through violence or the threat of it. And the bank regulators, agencies like the FDIC, the Federal Home Loan Bank Board, they often look the other way, letting redlining continue, sometimes claiming it was just about economic risk, not race, even when the evidence screamed otherwise.
It seems like they used every lever, even taxes.
Yeah, that's another layer Rothstein uncovers. Many cities and counties systematically overassessed property values in black neighborhoods while underassessing them in white areas.
Meaning black homeowners paid higher property taxes relative to their home's actual worth.
Yes, compared to white homeowners. That sucked money out of black families' pockets, made it harder to maintain homes, harder to save, contributed to blight, and made them more likely to lose their homes in tax foreclosure sales, which speculators then snapped up.
Unbelievable, it feels like. Everything was tilted, even building roads.
Oh, absolutely. The interstate highway system. Federally funded state and local governments routed those massive highways, often deliberately, right through the middle of thriving black neighborhoods.
Not just near them, but through them.
Through them, bulldozing homes, businesses, churches. It was presented as urban renewal or slum clearance, but it destroyed communities, displaced thousands, and often created literal concrete barriers reinforcing racial lines.
I remember that quote you mentioned Rothstein found.
Yeah, from a top highway official talking about how city leaders saw the highways as a convenient way to, quote, get rid of the local nigger town. It's stark, shows the intent.
Just wow.
And it wasn't just highways. Think about where cities put things or didn't put things.
How do you mean?
Like in Austin, Texas. After explicit racial zoning was banned, their 1928 city plan basically said, okay, we'll encourage the black population to move to this one specific area on the east side. By putting all the segregated city services for black residents, schools, parks, libraries only in that designated district. Want to go to the library? Got to live over there. It effectively zoned people by controlling access to basic services.
And the flip side, putting unwanted things in black neighborhoods.
Exactly. Zoning exceptions were granted to put polluting factories, garbage dumps, toxic waste sites disproportionately in or right next to African American communities. An EPA report later confirmed this was a nationwide pattern.
Which leads to health problems.
Higher asthma rates, other issues, yeah. It adds to blight, makes the area seem undesirable, which then fuels more white flight from adjacent areas. It's all connected.
Rothstein also brings up labor market discrimination. How does that fit into that housing picture?
Well, it's about economic power, right? He points out that government agencies, like the National Labor Relations Board, often tolerated discriminatory practices by unions, especially powerful ones like the construction trades, and by employers.
Limiting jobs and pay for black workers.
Right, which meant less income, less ability to save for a down payment, less ability to afford a home in those appreciating government-subsidized white suburbs, even if by some miracle one became available to them. It reinforced the economic side of the segregation.
Okay, so stepping back and looking at all of this.
Yeah.
FHA, VA loans, public housing siting and rules, police complicity, the courts, biased taxes, highway routes where services were placed, pollution zoning, labor practices. It's not just one thing.
No, it's a system, a comprehensive interlocking system largely orchestrated or enabled by government at all levels, specifically designed to create and enforce racial segregation. And that leads us to the lasting damage, the impact today.
And when you think about consequences, the biggest one has to be the wealth gap, right?
Without a doubt. That denial of access to federally subsidized home ownership in appreciating white suburbs while simultaneously boosting it for white families, that's the bedrock of the huge, persistent, inherited wealth gap between black and white Americans. Home equity is the main way middle-class families build wealth, and the government systematically blocked black families from that path for decades.
And those effects just cascade down through generations.
Exactly. And that residential segregation built by government directly creates other inequalities we're still fighting.
Like schools.
Segregated neighborhoods means segregated schools, often with wildly different levels of resources, teacher experience, everything, which leads to unequal outcomes.
And health, you mentioned the pollution.
Yeah, living near those deliberately placed industrial sites or highways means exposure to more pollution, worse health outcomes, like the higher asthma rates in black children. That affects school attendance, job prospects, everything.
And concentrating poverty.
Right. Those policies that changed public housing, plus demolishing integrated working-class black neighborhoods for highways or urban renewal, without providing integrated alternatives anywhere else that concentrated poverty in specific urban areas, cutting people off from opportunity.
So the key point Rothstein makes is that because this was de jure segregation, state-sponsored, unconstitutional action, just stopping future discrimination isn't enough. It doesn't fix the damage done.
Exactly. He argues it requires constitutional remedies. He even links it back to the 13th Amendment, the one abolishing slavery. He argues Congress has the power under that amendment to eliminate the lingering badges and incidents of slavery. And he sees state-sponsored residential segregation as a primary badge or incident, trapping people based on race.
So why isn't this history better known? Why is it so often forgotten, as the book title says?
Well, it's deeply uncomfortable, isn't it? To admit that our own government, the institutions meant to represent everyone, were actually the main architects of racial segregation. It challenges that whole American narrative of opportunity for all.
Yeah.
The de facto story, the myth, is much easier. It lets government off the hook. It suggests it's just individuals or economics or something vague. No one specific is really to blame, certainly not the state itself.
Even the words we use can hide it.
Totally. Calling segregated areas inner cities instead of ghettos. Ghetto historically implies a place where a group is confined, often by state action. Inner city sounds more neutral, geographical. It helps obscure the government's hand in creating those confined spaces.
So when we started, we talked about looking at our own communities. The color of law forces us to see that segregation isn't just some natural state of affairs.
Right, it's not an accident. It's not just private prejudice, though that existed too. Rothstein's argument, backed by tons of evidence, is that it was a direct result of deliberate, systematic government policy that violated the Constitution.
We walked through so many of those policies: housing finance, zoning, public housing, highways, policing, taxes, all working together.
A whole system built to separate people by race.
So maybe the question for you listening now as you think about your own area is this: if government deliberately created this system of segregation, What responsibility does government have now to actively dismantle it? What kind of action would it take to undo something that was built so intentionally?
Because, as Rothstein argues, when the government violates the Constitution, there's an obligation to provide a remedy. And understanding how this system was built by law and policy is the absolutely critical first step before we can even talk seriously about what those remedies might look like.
So, the key takeaway from Richard Rothstein's The Color of Law is that racial segregation in America wasn't an accident or just private bias. It was manufactured by explicit, unconstitutional government policies at every level. And knowing that de jure history is absolutely essential if we want to understand and finally address the deep inequalities that persist today.